So our speaker is Thomas Maier, and he'll speak about his book, The Invisible Spy, Churchill's Rockefeller Center Spy Ring, and America's First Secret Agent of World War II. The Invisible Spy is the story of Ernest Cuno, an ex-NFL player who in 1940 became America's first spy of the Second World War. Cuno worked secretly with Winston Churchill's spies based at Rockefeller Center in New York City, which included Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, who dedicated his novel Thunderball to Cuno. Thomas Maier will also talk about mafia spies, how the CIA hired two gangsters to assassinate Cuba's Fidel Castro, and how these cases help to influence today's intelligence agencies and the debate about the so-called deep state. Thomas Maier is a multi-award winning author, television producer, and former investigative reporter, columnist, and editorial board member from Newsday, where he worked for over 40 years. He is the author and producer of the Emmy-winning Showtime drama series, Masters of Sex, adapted from his dual biography of William Masters and Virginia Johnson. He's also the author of Mafia Spies, a 6-part documentary series which appeared in 2024. As an investigative reporter at Newsday, Maier twice won the National Society for Professional Journalists Award, and he also won the Daniel Pearl Award for investigative journalism. Thomas Maier is a graduate of Fordham University and received his master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. It is therefore with my great pleasure to introduce to the RMA, Thomas Maier.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So little did I know I would be writing a book about a group of spies that Churchill put up on the 36th floor of the International Building at Rockefeller Center. I don't know, I presume most people have been to Rockefeller Center. The International Building is the one that's directly across from St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's got the big, the statue holding the earth like that. In May of 1940, when Winston Churchill becomes the prime minister, and he's taking over, and England is facing an existential crisis, as they say. I mean, that's an existential crisis is almost an understatement for what the situation that he's in. Have been ignoring what Winston has been saying about this guy named Hitler, and he's been saying it since 1932, 33, and now Hitler has gone swept through Western Europe, through France, and he's at the doorstep of London. And they feel that invasion is imminent in England, and that is finally when they turn to Winston Churchill, and he becomes the prime minister. That's May of 1940. But bear in mind, a year and a half later, in May of 1940, FDR is running for a third term. He's running for a third term, and he's going around the country saying that I won't send your boys to war. I hate war. That's my FDR imitation, if you don't recognize it. And he's doing that. But at the same time, Roosevelt, who's a really smart fellow, is recognizing that Hitler has to be stopped. And that, like it or not, America is going to have to get involved in the war. And so that is kind of sets the table, if you will, for my book. My book, The Invisible Spy, this one here, that's The Invisible Spy. That's my new book. And this is really, what this book is about, it's fundamentally about the beginning of America's modern espionage. We were decidedly against the idea of getting involved with espionage. In fact, our Secretary of War, yes, that used to be the title until it just recently came back. There was a title, and the fellow who was in charge, that was the Secretary of War, was a fellow named Henry Stimson. And Stimson famously said that gentlemen do not read the mail of other gentlemen. He was saying, I'm against intelligence. And that's what spying fundamentally is. Spying is about, this book is about intelligence. And certainly the Russians were involved in spying. You'll read that in this book a great deal, particularly towards the back end of the book when we get into the Cold War. Um, and certainly the Nazis understood that. And Winston Churchill, from the very beginning of his career, understood that in spying, that intelligence is a very necessary and probably the cheapest weapon in your armament, in your arsenal, in protecting yourself, that intelligence, spying, is the most effective weapon in that regard. And so Winston was a big believer, but we weren't. It was indicative of our history of being an isolationist country, of even George Washington, when he left office, said, after 2 terms, he said, he warned about getting involved in foreign entanglements. And so we had a different tradition. It played itself out in World War I, 20 years earlier. We were late to get into that war. There were a number of Americans who were killed. It was still fresh in people's minds. And so Roosevelt knew what he was dealing with. He was a terrific politician in the very best sense of the word. He understood that America did not want to go into war. We didn't really have the taste for it. We wanted to be isolationists. We felt that the ocean was the big pond between us and Western Europe. And so if we were to get involved with war, it would be a gradual process in which the American people, public opinion, would have to go from a view of being against war, I hate war, as FDR was saying, to recognizing that we had to deal with this existential threat of Adolf Hitler and what an evil, overwhelming evil it was. And that, like, ultimately, like most evil, it has to be confronted at a certain point. So, as I mentioned, just by way of introduction, as it was mentioned, I have spent most of my life as a reporter. Fundamentally, I've been writing biographies. At Fordham, I took a class, a Jesuit who was a book reviewer for Commonweal and America Magazine, taught a class called American Biography. You had to read one biography every week. It was a very demanding class, and write about it as well. And we read a number of those books, but in many ways, my writing career has just been an extension of that class that I took back in 1977 in the Bronx at Rose Hill there. So I've done a lot of biographies that have been windows on the world. I wrote a book about Dr. Spock, the baby doctor. My first book was about the Newhouse, Cy Newhouse and the Newhouse media empire. That's Anna Wintour and Tina Brown and all the folks from Condé Nast. Spock was number 2. Then I wrote a book about the Kennedys, but from a point of view that despite my Germanic last name, I basically grew up in an Irish Catholic milieu. I'm at Fordham, and I was always curious about how the Irish Catholic immigrant experience of the Kennedys informed their lives. And so I wrote a big fat book that came out in 2003 called The Kennedys, America's Emerald King. This book has a lot to do about detailing the relationship between the Churchills and the Kennedys. In doing this book, I came across a letter. You know, when you do a big book like this, there's certain things that you just don't fit in there. You don't have room for. And one of the things I came across in my research was a letter from an actor, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. You may remember him in Gunga Din, for instance. He's one of the people along with Cary Grant in that movie. But he was a very prominent actor. A lot of friends in the British community. And he was out in Hollywood when Joe Kennedy went out to Hollywood, gave a talk. Joe Kennedy gave a talk to a group of Hollywood producers. Kennedy had been a Hollywood producer. Yes, liquor, yes, Wall Street, yes, real estate. But he was also a Hollywood producer, Joe Kennedy was. That huge Kennedy fortune that he amassed over the years. And so he's talking to these producers, and he's basically telling them, you know, I'm over there as the ambassador. There's this guy, Hitler, and we better uh, get along with Hitler. He's a guy that we're just going to have to learn to live with. You can imagine how well that went over with a group of Hollywood producers in Los Angeles. And sitting in that crowd was Douglas Fairbanks Jr. He's outraged by what he hears. He writes a letter to the president, Roosevelt, but he also sends a letter to Rockefeller Center on the 36th floor to the British Security Coordination. What the hell is that? I said. And I looked it up and I realized that the British had put together what would become the biggest spy operation, foreign spy operation on U.S. soil in U.S. history. Nothing like it. Almost 1,000 spies went through that building at Rockefeller Center, leading up to the war and through the war. And so that kind of got me interested in it. I said, that's really interesting. It didn't wind up, I didn't have room for, I think I did just fleetingly mention it in this book. But I said, that's interesting. Now, who dealt with them? And that's when I came across a man named Ernest Cuneo. Ernest Cuneo would be my window. Remember I said about I like to find biographies that are where the subject is a window onto a broad time period or thematically. It's a window into some broader subjects. Yes, it's the story of an individual. And that was certainly the case with Ernest Cuneo. I realized that this would be a book. Once I had the Ernest Cuneo connection, in other words, he was the American who FDR appointed secretly to deal with the Churchill spies by summer of 1940, about a year and a half before we're at war. So when when Roosevelt's going around famously at the Boston Garden just before Election Day in 1940 and saying, I hate war, he's setting up Ernest Cuneo already to work with the British spies at Rockefeller Center. So how did this all come about? I'm looking at this and I said, wait a minute. How the hell did Winston Churchill, how did anybody get permission to set up a foreign spy operation in the heart of New York City? Aside from the fact that, New Yorkers, we think we know everything. You can't get anything past us. We're New Yorkers. We know everything. And all these people are walking past that building, international building, clueless about the fact that there's a foreign spy operation up on the 36th floor. So I thought that was something that was just too irresistible for me. I did worry in doing this book about, wait a minute, this guy, Ernest Cuneo, nobody knows who he is. He deliberately wanted to be the invisible spy. He literally felt it was a point of honor to remain anonymous. And in the sense that he realized that you can get a lot more done in this world by not taking credit for it, by being kind of in the shadows, but being friends with everybody so that he could get things done. And so he became a very intriguing person to me. So who is Ernest Cuneo? Well, he went to Columbia. He was an Italian-American kid from Jersey. He was the baby of the family. The rest of the family, both his parents were, were immigrants from Italy. But other family members were in trades and various different, they worked with their hands. He was the very smart baby in the family, kind of like what Mario Cuomo actually was in his family. And who went off to college. And the reason why the ticket into college was the fact that Ernest was an excellent athlete. He was a terrific wrestler, but he was also a football player. And he was so good that he joined the fledgling organization known as the NFL, the National Football League. This is in 1929, 30, 31. That was the time period in which that Ernest joined the NFL. Not only offense, but you'd also play all 60 minutes. He played defense as well. So I used to play in high school. I played tight end. So I had a little idea of that. But the fact that I went to Columbia and that we actually had a winning Columbia football team, that was really, truly amazing to me. So Ernest, just at the same time that he's playing in the NFL, this is not, where he has a PR agent and an attorney and a sneaker deal. This is a time period, the beginning of this league, where games they would collect the receipts, and at the end of the game they would get paid from the receipts. This was also a league where everybody had to find another job during the off season. And so what he did was, he did two things. He went to St. John's Law School here in New York, and he also worked at nights for the New York Daily News. He covered murders for the New York Daily News, and he learned how to write really fast. He met a lot of media people. One of the media people that he met, very key, was a guy named Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell, it's hard to imagine, even for us, I'm roughly in the same age group here, just how prominent Walter Winchell was back in those days. He was in literally hundreds of newspapers with his column, but he was also had a radio program at night on Sunday nights. This is before television, so this is like in the 30s, where people on Sunday nights, they would listen to Walter Winchell. And so Ernest, when he gets his law degree, he does two things. He winds up first working for Fiorello LaGuardia. He writes later on a biography called Fiorello with an exclamation point that became a musical in 1960. It won the Pulitzer Prize. He didn't take credit for that, believe it or not. I'm still amazed by that. But he worked for Fiorello LaGuardia for a few years, but then when Roosevelt gets elected and takes office in 33, Roosevelt, who actually went to Columbia Law School, had a number of different people in the New York area or in the Harvard orbit, if you will, who were part of what was the press called them the Brain Trust. They were known as the Brain Trust. And they were the people that were very much involved in the programs that Roosevelt set up during the Depression to get us out of the Depression, things like Social Security, all the various different agencies that were set up there. And Ernest winds up getting a job going from LaGuardia. he winds up working as an advance man for the president. The advance man, for those of you who may not know what that is, it's somebody who will go, I'm the president of the United States, and I'm going to speak in Cleveland 2 days from now. That advance man is, or woman would already be out there setting up things, making sure you had the high school bands playing when I arrive. So he was doing that type of thing, but he also became eventually associate counsel of the National Democratic Party. And he had his own his own personal law practice by about 36 or so. And so he was working for the Democrats, he was working for the president, had his own private firm, but he was also the lawyer for Winston Churchill. And so that leads me up to this time period in May of 1940, when Churchill has decided the only way I'm going to stop Hitler, and he tells this to his son Randolph, he's shaving as soon as he becomes the prime minister. There's a pretty famous scene that's in this book here, where Randolph says, Dad, how are you going to do this? Randolph was a journalist like his father. Both of them were writers, and both of them had warned about Hitler. So it's 1940. Now Winston's in charge. He's the prime minister. How are you going to do this? And he said, I've got to get the United States behind us. I got to get them into the war. And so what he does is, very quickly, and I explain this very much in this book, he approaches a guy named William Stevenson, AKA Intrepid was his code name. He had been an aviator, a war hero in World War I, and he was also a pretty independently wealthy guy. So Churchill has Stevenson as the main spy master for Rockefeller Center. But to do this operation, they got to get the approval of the United States secretly, top secret, really top secret type of thing. So he goes to the head of the FBI, guy named J. Edgar Hoover. You may have heard of his name before. And Hoover had become famous partly because of Walter Winchell. And Hoover, strange guy on one level, but also a pretty crafty guy on another level, a good investigator. One of the things, though, he cultivated his celebrity, he cultivated his public image by, on Sunday nights, when Walter Winchell finished his radio program, Winchell would be at the Stork Club in Manhattan. He had his own table. And at the table was his lawyer, Ernest Cuneo, friendly, but staying in the background. But Hoover would hang out. And so Hoover actually knew Ernest Cuneo because they used to hang out at Walter Winchell's table at the Stork Club. And so all these type of famous Dillinger arrests and all these other type of things that happen. And there were a number of different type of crimes, high-profile crimes that the FBI became famous for. A lot of that was pushed by Walter Winchell through Ernest Cuneo. So Stevenson goes to Hoover, and he explains that we want to set this up. And Hoover says, look, you can't set this up without the president's approval. Stevenson says, well, how do I do that? Do you have any idea? He says, yeah, I think I know. What you should do is approach this guy, Ernest Cuneo. And Cuneo, sure enough, is approached. He goes to the White House. They discuss it, and it's approved. And in doing so, like most things in life, once you suggest something, they say, great idea. Tag, you're it. That, in other words, Ernest, you'll be the one. You'll be the invisible spy. And, that was something that is interesting because in Cuneo's life, he had, when he was playing football, he loved being in the newspaper. And at one point, he almost lost an eye, and he was in the hospital. His father, who I mentioned, Italian immigrant guy, a hardworking guy, saying, "What are you doing? You're going to wind up blind. You know, you got to do a more serious thing than become a football player all your life." And so he, between that dressing down by his father, but also by working as an advance man in the background, but somebody who got things done, um, he learned that instead of seeking fame, that anonymity was really the shield, that invisibility was the best way for him to get things done. So when he becomes the invisible spy, he eventually, um, by the time Pearl Harbor happens, President Roosevelt, who has been resisting the idea of setting up a spy agency, Hoover wanted to do international spying as well as being a domestic uh, FBI. He wanted to expand the power of the FBI. Roosevelt didn't want that, thank heavens. Um, so when Pearl Harbor happens, Roosevelt sets up the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. There were a number of people who worked for the OSS, Julia Child, for instance, Arthur Schlesinger, loads of very eclectic crowd, if you will. But the first hire, the first one there, the one who's already working as the OSS, is Ernest Cuneo. And his title is perfectly situated for Ernest Cuneo. His title is, he's the liaison. What's the liaison? Well, it means anything that Ernest wanted or anything that they needed. He was, we use that phrase, the deep state. You hear that on being bandied about, that phrase, the deep state. Well, there are people, I mean, a lot of that's baloney. But there are people in government who know how, and thank God they do, they know how to make things work. And they're there, usually civil service people, but he was one of those people that knew. So being the liaison for the OSS, he not only dealt with the Brits, he dealt with the Justice Department. He knew the Attorney General had been at Columbia. He knew him. At the State Department as well. I describe all of this in the book. And so he knew, and of course, Hoover at the FBI. So he was exquisitely placed to deal with a number of different things. The person that Roosevelt puts in charge is a guy named William Wild Bill Donovan, was his nickname, and he was the head of the OSS. Time does not permit me to really go into any much more detail about the book. Fundamentally, you know what I said about that Christmas tree when I proposed to my lovely wife, Joyce? Well, in a way, this book is written like a Christmas tree, in the sense that the basic spine of the book is the story, the window of Ernest Cuneo's life. But because of his position, he was involved in a number of spy stories that I put on the tree, if you will, like ornaments. He was both directly involved with spy cases and indirectly. There were two people that Ernest met at Rockefeller Center that changed his life. One was a woman named Margaret Watson, who was a female Canadian spy, very bright woman, and they fall in love. So there's a whole love story about Ernest and Margaret Watson and their children, who are now were adult children when I was doing the research for this. The son, Jonathan, just recently died, but he was a really great help for me. And he's one of the people I dedicate this book to. And his daughter, Sandra Cuneo, we had dinner when we were out in Los Angeles this past summer with her. But they were both very helpful to me in explaining that relationship. But the even more interesting relationship, at least as a reader, is that the person that Ernest Cuneo becomes best friends with is a British spy. His name is Ian Fleming. And Fleming's working for British Naval Intelligence. He later creates James Bond character. Two of the Bond books are dedicated to Ernest Cuneo. And that's how close they were as friends. They were totally opposite guys. I mean, Ernest is this big former NFL player, whereas Ian Fleming is this tall, rather effete, upper class British guy, coming up with all these spy ideas. One of the spy ideas that he had was Operation Mincemeat, which is now a Broadway musical. And if you go look in Google and New York Times 2 months ago, I wrote a full-page article in the New York Times about Ernest Cuneo and Ian Fleming in there, and off of the Operation Mincemeat. So there were a lot of different things, but one of the things that in the first Bond book, Casino Royale, is a scene where about basically in real life, Stevenson, the spy master at Rockefeller Center for Churchill, in the middle of the night, they broke into the Japanese consul's office, and they stole the codes there, and they photographed them, and then they went back and they put it back in the safe, and presumably the Japanese did not know that we had stolen or that the Brits had stolen their codes there. Fleming was part of that operation, but he used it later on in his first book, Casino Royale. He actually upped the ante, where they actually assassinated one of the people. They fired through the window at one of the Japanese people in that consul's office. Fundamentally, what the British were trying to do was they said to Hoover, we just want to keep the supply lines open between Great Britain and America. The second thing but there were two other things that they did. One is that they kept an eye on all the Nazi spies in the New York area, and also on the isolationists who were opposing entry into the war. And in the 1940 election, the British got very involved, with Cuneo's help, in undermining some of the congressional elections of those people that were isolationists. There were a number of different people. Hamilton Fish, who was a congressman in upstate New York in the Poughkeepsie area, they definitely impacted his election. That was really interesting to me, and I spelled that all out. There were a number of different stunts that were designed to get involved in our elections. But the third thing, and the most important thing, was a propaganda campaign that was run out by the Churchill spies at Rockefeller Center, designed mainly through people like Walter Winchell or another client of Ernest Cuneo's, Drew Pearson, who ran the Washington Merry-Go-Round column. He also had a radio program. On Sunday nights, right after Walter Winchell, you had Drew Pearson. He had his own radio program, and he had more of an investigative tone. He was at the whole view of the British was funneled through the media, and very effectively. And what's interesting about it is that they wrote a history of what they had done at the end of the war, and that book didn't come out until like 1968, 69. And actually, that was a good resource for me, because they do actually acknowledge and describe some of the things that they did. That book was put together by another British spy, Roald Dahl, who was later the children's author, James and the Giant Peach or something like that. So anyway, it's extraordinary what they do. The relationship, the friendship between Cuneo and Ian Fleming, though, is really the last third of the book, where I talk about, for instance, they go on a long trip across America to continue writing about James Bond. Fleming realizes he's got to know more about America. So they travel out to Chicago, Las Vegas, and out to Hollywood and such. Cuneo also becomes friends with Allen Dulles, and I talk about what happens there. And the biggest surprise in my book, there's two big surprises, and both of them are revealed at the back of the book. One is that there was a double agent, apparently, in a very prominent position among the Churchill spies who helped America create our first spy agency, who was involved in everything. And Cuneo didn't know it, Stevenson didn't know it, and it didn't come out till years later. And so I described that, and I mentioned that. But the other big surprise, and I'm going to wrap it up with this, a connection there where Dulles, when he was on the Warren Commission, was leaking to Ernest Cuneo. And I found that in documents, FBI documents. You know, what does this mean for today? I think that's why it's really important. I think it means a lot today, this book. I think it's remarkable when you read this book particularly, but even the other book, When Lions Roar. Both these books are a time period in which there's a lot of similarities. You know, bear in mind, Churchill was the great anti-fascist who warned us about the threat of Hitler. He was the one who was a staunch free trader who was against the idea, for instance, of tariffs. He loathed the totalitarian grip of Russia and fighting tyranny in Eastern Europe. You know, somebody like Zelensky clearly is modeling himself when we talk about Winston Churchill, is his impact as an author, as a writer, fundamentally the power of words and how rhetoric and words can move the heart, the human heart, how it can move a nation. As certainly we look back at Churchill, his speeches, the finest hour type of speeches, they moved a nation. But it also moved a young man by the name of John F. Kennedy. You know, I described that a great deal in this book about the impact of Churchill on John F. Kennedy. And, you know, when Kennedy in 1960, he had an acceptance speech in Los Angeles. That's where the Democratic Party was, Democratic Convention was that year. And, you know, he made it pretty clear. It's funny that people haven't picked up on it as much as I think they should have, but in his speech before the Los Angeles crowd, Democratic Convention, Kennedy said, "We are not here to curse the darkness, but to light the candle that can guide us through that darkness to a safe and sane future," Kennedy told the crowd, reprising the imagery of Churchill's 1940 Their Finest Hour speech. Quote, "As Winston Churchill said on taking office some 20 years ago, if we open a quarrel between the present and the past, we shall be in danger of losing the future." My book stresses the importance of spying as a tool of warfare, as I mentioned. That's fundamental. It's about the origins. How did all of this start? Cuneo is the window. He's a fascinating Renaissance man in many, many ways. But ultimately, it's interesting that that building where I proposed to my wife, the International Building at Rockefeller Center, inside that building, you walk in and you see a bust of not Stevenson or anybody else, not Churchill. You see a bust of Charles Lindbergh, a man who was, yes, an aviation hero, but he was also a rabid anti-Semite who was very much against the war. And so, you know, it's kind of an odd thing. I actually threw a picture of Lindbergh in my book there. There was more than 1,000 Churchill spies who worked in that building, and yet there's nothing to pay homage to what they did. And what they did was tremendous. It really helped open our eyes to the threat of Hitler. So my suggestion is that instead of a statue of Lindbergh there, the folks at Rockefeller Center may think about instead a statue of Stevenson, intrepid, Churchill's spy master in New York, and his American partner, Ernest Cuneo, the invisible spy. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I appreciate it.